Imagine standing before the families of 10 people murdered in cold blood and telling them their pain doesn't even merit a mention in your testimony. That's exactly what Kristi Noem was confronted with today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Noem, thank you for your time before this committee. Today is a solemn day for my community in Buffalo, New York. 3 years ago, on May 14th, 2022, a gunman, motivated by racism and hatred, drove 2.5 hours from his home to the east side of Buffalo to carry out an act of domestic terrorism. Equipped with enhanced body armor, a tactical helmet, and a semi-automatic rifle, the gunman opened fire at a local grocery store in a predominantly black community. In just 123 seconds, he took 10 innocent souls that day, severely injured 3, and traumatized countless other individuals. Because of this act of domestic terrorism, radicalized and indoctrinated online, and carried out in the name of white supremacy, families in my community will never be whole again. Buffalo now joins a growing list of communities impacted by mass shootings carried out by lone wolf, homegrown, domestically radicalized, disturbed individuals. Secretary Noem, in your written testimony today, there's not one mention of this kind of threat to the homeland. You refer to foreign terrorist organizations. You refer to aliens who are affiliated with foreign terrorism. You refer to arrests of suspected gang members. Not once do you mention the term domestic terrorism, domestic terrorist, or lone wolf. There's a gaping hole in your testimony today. You fail to reassure this committee or the American people that you'll protect the homeland from bad actors, radicalized right here in the U.S., like the gunman who opened fire on my community 3 years ago today. There's been a systematic, intentional effort by your department and this administration since January 20th to ignore the very real threat posed by domestic terrorism. This is a blatant negligence made abundantly clear by the administration's budget and by President Trump's broader actions to defund the Department of Homeland Security initiatives that track and prevent domestic terrorism. The Trump administration's budget proposal for the Department of Homeland Security completely eliminates the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, a critical DHS program dedicated to helping local communities, including law enforcement, to develop and strengthen efforts to counter attacks of targeted violence and terrorism, just like the racist Buffalo attack. This exact grant program awarded nearly $1 million in the aftermath of the 514 shooting in Western New York to help close research gaps about the radicalization of domestic terrorists, develop violence prevention modules, and improve bystander intervention. This program was also used to harden safety and prevention efforts in other communities that experienced targeted domestic terrorism, including a school shooting in Oakland County, Michigan, and a pattern of other domestic terrorist incidents. The budget proposal you're defending today justifies the elimination of this funding by arguing it was, quote, weaponized to target Americans exercising their First Amendment rights, end quote. If the suggestion that an act of domestic terrorism, which took the lives of 10 innocent people and forever changed my community, qualifies as protected First Amendment speech, then explain that to the families of the victims who were killed that day. Under this administration, we have a Department of Homeland Security that is making excuses for domestic terrorists under the guise of free speech and insulting communities like mine, especially on a day like today, as we mark the anniversary of unimaginable violence and loss. We can do better, and we must do better. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
What we just witnessed was not just another congressional back and forth. It was Congressman Tim Kennedy bringing the weight of his community's grief directly into the halls of power and demanding accountability from Kristi Noem in real time. Kennedy wasn't speaking in the abstract. He was speaking on the 3rd anniversary of the Buffalo Massacre, when a young white supremacist armed with military-style gear drove hours to deliberately target Black lives in a neighborhood grocery store. 10 people murdered in under 2 minutes, families shattered, a community left scarred forever. That's not theory. That's not distant. That's the lived reality of domestic terrorism in America today. And here's the heart of his critique. In Noem's testimony, there wasn't a single mention of this threat. Not the phrase domestic terrorism, not lone wolf attacks, not even a nod to the reality that the most pressing danger to American lives isn't always coming from abroad. It's often radicalized, homegrown, festering online, and exploding in our own neighborhoods. Now, this isn't a small oversight. Kennedy points out that under the Trump administration, DHS funding to help communities prevent this kind of violence was gutted. The Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, which had provided Buffalo nearly $1 million after the massacre, was eliminated on the grounds that it was supposedly being weaponized against free speech. Let's pause here. This is where the clash becomes crystal clear. What Kennedy is saying is that families who bury their loved ones after racially motivated massacres don't see that violence as free speech. They see it as terrorism. They see it as preventable. And when DHS defunds the very programs that could save lives, then tells communities it's in the name of protecting the First Amendment, it feels less like defending democracy and more like abandoning victims. This is bigger than Buffalo. This is about whether America is willing to look domestic terrorism in the eye and call it what it is. Because every time we treat white nationalist violence as an isolated act rather than part of a broader threat, we make it easier for the next tragedy to unfold. And that's what made Kennedy's words so cutting. He wasn't debating policy in a vacuum. He was demanding that Kristi Noem explain her department's omissions to the families who've lost everything. Because those families don't get the luxury of framing this as a budget line item or a free speech debate. They live with empty chairs at their dinner tables, anniversaries that will never be the same, and communities that will always carry the trauma. So the bigger question here isn't just whether DHS is underestimating the threat of domestic terrorism. It's whether our leaders have the courage to prioritize the safety and dignity of American lives over political spin and ideological convenience. And maybe the most important takeaway is this. When we ignore the threat from within, we send a message to extremists that their hate has space to grow unchecked. But when we confront it, in our policies, in our budgets, and in our rhetoric, we send a very different message, that communities like Buffalo will not be forgotten, and that justice will not be optional. So as viewers, this isn't just about watching a heated moment in Congress. It's about asking ourselves what kind of country we're willing to accept. Are we okay with leaders who sidestep the reality of domestic terrorism? Or do we want leaders who will name it, fund prevention, and protect communities before tragedy strikes again? That's where your voice matters. Pay attention to the policies that get cut and the ones that get funded. Share these stories so they aren't drowned out by political noise. And above all, honor the victims by refusing to let their deaths be in vain. Because the fight for safety, dignity, and accountability doesn't just happen in hearings like this one. It happens in whether we stay engaged after the cameras stop rolling.